Today's Fiction Craft Talk is by Matthew Neill Null. And for those of you who don't know, Matthew is a recipient of the Mary McCarthy Prize and the Missionary Copernicus Society of America Award. His fiction appears in American Short Fiction, Egotone, The Oxford American, the Penn O. Henry Prize Stories, the Best American Mystery Stories. A native of West Virginia, he holds an MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop and was a fellow at the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, where he is currently the writing coordinator. Honey from the Line is his first novel, which was published by our very own Lookout Books here at UNCW. Please welcome Matthew.
Okay, thank you, Eli. Can everyone hear me? Okay? You're okay? What about in the back? Good thumbs up. I always wondered, it's like turn it up, but I guess you're okay. So this is set up like a multimedia experience. It's not really going to be a multimedia experience. I don't have any slides. I do have some excerpts, and there are a few copies around, mostly in the front, floating around. If you don't have one, don't worry, because I'm going to read just a few passages by other writers and point out some things. So this is kind of a digressive talk on writing historical fiction and bringing emotional immediacy to it. I have some prepared remarks, so I'll go through those and digress at certain points, and maybe at the end, if we have time, if there are any questions, anyone wants to talk about it. But first, before we talk about historical fiction, which my novel, I guess you would say, is a historical novel, the first thing I'd like to say, it's wonderful being here with so many students and writers. And the first thing I would say that I'm not too far gone from the MFA world in that grad school stage, and I remember all the old anxieties. It comes flooding back, and it's immediate and unmistakable. So I'd say that, as you're writing and you're starting out, it's never too early to start thinking of your vision, your myth. The best writers are immediately recognizable from any page of their fiction. Writers like Mavis Gallant, Faulkner, Flannery O'Connor, Henry Green, Shirley Hazzard. And it's this force they have. It's like they have this great underground river that flows beneath their work, and wherever they drive the spear, the river comes bubbling up, and they can't help it. The river is their myth, and their spear is the sentence. This personality gives a powerful and essential foundation to their work. This isn't to say that their vision is static. A great writer must change over the arc of her books. But even though Dubliners and Finnegan's Wake are, of course, radically different, both are immediately recognizable as James Joyce. He hewed to his vision, and now that's as close as a writer can come to be an immortal. And that's what we all want. We're afraid of death, and our writing is a bid to live on past what we're allotted on this earth. And this powerful, essential vision, how do you find it? Coming out of the MFA world and being around a lot of young writers, I don't think you become a writer like that by trying to craft a story that will appear in next week's New Yorker. I think that's a commercial vision and not an artistic one. But I think you can be an artist and pursue an artistic vision, and you can have commercial and worldly success. But I don't think it works the other way. I don't think you can start pursuing that commercial vision or having those goals in mind. I want to publish here, I want to do this and do that, and then become an artist. Because I think when you get into that rut, it's really hard to pull out of it. And I think about a lot of people I knew, and they're relentlessly pursuing that careerist bent, but they don't have that vision and that myth. And I think that's really what's going to give your work lasting power to be read in not just the decades, but the centuries to come. You want your work to be reread. So don't lose sight of what you want to accomplish. Don't think of next year. You do have to think of your work in terms of decades. What do you want your work to be? What do you want it to do? And I think you have to start now when you're starting out. You probably won't write your best work in the next decade, but it's still important work, and you have to do it now. So don't wait. You can't wait for that vision to find you. These people like Flannery O'Connor or Henry Green, you have to think now, what is the underground river? What's the personality beneath my work? And that will give life to your sentences. And I've been thinking about the MFA world a lot because I am a product of it. And I serve on the Fine Arts Works Center writing committee. I run the fellowship program there. And last year we had 445 fiction manuscripts for 4 spots, right? So, most of them are MFA applicants or MFA graduates or soon to be. And there were, I get to see a lot of trends because if you're reading for admissions in an MFA program, you're getting people at a different stage, but I'm reading people who mostly are just getting out of one, or are a few years out. And I have to tell you, there were a couple or 300 perfectly good stories, and you could see them being published in magazines, but you would see that all the sharp edges, the eccentricities, had been chiseled off, I think, through the workshop process. And they were perfectly good, but they had that machined feel, and I think that's a danger. The particular vision I felt had been too often abandoned for the communal vision, for acceptability. I believe that we should award ambition, contrarianism, the work that will likely be overlooked by the mainstream on the first pass. So I'd say that what to use your experience in an MFA program for, I would say take the parts, use it to strengthen your vision, but don't let it dilute the vision. It's important to hear what other people are saying, but don't lose sight of exactly what you're trying to accomplish. Take what's helpful, but don't take everything. Because if you're trying to please everyone, you please no one. And I was reading all these machine stories, and they were perfectly good. They were structurally, technically flawless, but they were missing something at their heart. So think now about what you want to accomplish, and that's, in my limited wisdom, is what I would say. Elizabeth McCracken said that writing is really an outlaw trade, and you can't make it respectable. So be careful trying to be a respectable writer. So today I'll talk about emotional immediacy in historical fiction. And I'm going to leave off defining what historical fiction is beyond saying that I'm not talking about genre fiction, but literary work that aspires to the complexity and ambiguity that is real life. So what's good about writing about the historical past? First off, it quickly creates a certain distance, the distance that a writer must have to approach her subject matter, holding the world at arm's length and considering the world with a cold horse trader's eye, like James Joyce's distant God, disinterested, paring his nails. As an aside, I'm going to talk for a second about Eudora Welty. And I would say, please read her, because I think what's happened to Eudora Welty is what used to happen with Emily Dickinson, where she's kind of pushed into this space as a safe, boring spinster and isn't taken as seriously as she should be. And I'm guilty of that. I was reading Flannery O'Connor, it was edgier. But now that I've reapproached Eudora Welty, I found that she's a deeply strange writer and must be read. I think the problem is that her most anthologized work is kind of chirpy and cute, Why I Live at the PO, which I don't really like. And I think it's a disservice because to me, she's a better writer in the third person. I have here, like most young people, I was drawn to Flannery O'Connor first for her flash and incredible sentences. But as the years go on, I find Welty much more convincing and subtle. Her work is more unpredictable and in line with the open experience of life. Whereas, whereas there's all this medieval machinery, I think, in Flannery O'Connor's stories. You can kind of see the gears grinding away, the symbolism, the suffocating at times dogma. The bull appears on the first paragraph, and it's no surprise that it gores the old lady on the final page. But when I read Eudora Welty, she touches on this concept of distance that's so important in historical fiction. In her fabulous essay, Some Notes on River Country, which is collected in The Eye of the Story, which all of you should read. I don't know if it's an essential book, but it's quite good, and it has many good things to say about writing and the use of time, and there are some copies of it and other things floating around. So in this passage from some notes on river country, she's writing about the old Natchez Trace, that 18th century trading path of Mississippi that inspired two of her best stories, The Wide Net and First Love. People read those? Anybody familiar? They're very good. They're her second book of stories, which is, I think, overlooked. Most of the earlier stories are read. But I'm just going to read this little excerpt of Eudora Weldy. I have never seen in this small section of old Mississippi River country and its little chain of lost towns between Vicksburg and Natchez anything so mundane as ghosts, but I have felt many times there a sense of place as powerful as if it were visible and walking and could touch me. The clatter of hoofs and the bellow of boats have gone, all old communications. The old Natchez Trace has sunk out of use, it is deep in leaves. The river has gone away and left the landings. Boats from Liverpool do not dock at these empty crags. And here the most important part of the essay. The old deeds are done, old evil and old good have been made into stories as plows turn up river bottom, and the wild birds fly now at the level where people on boat deck once were strolling and talking of great expanding things and of chance and money. Much beauty has gone, many little things of life. In writing of the distant past, we are given the gift of hindsight, of comprehension, and great spans of time and outcome that leap beyond the narrow strictures of a single human life, allowing us to mine the strata of successive cultures and generations. These points are so obvious that I won't belabor them. The knowledge, hindsight, and distance allows us to pay great attention to structure and style, and it's no coincidence that some of our great prose stylists, like Michael Ondaatje, Alan Gurganus, Toni Morrison, Edward P. Jones, and Ron Hansen, have written their best work about the historical past. They recapture lost worlds, and just as an aside, the best historical fiction is about forgotten characters, marginal people. When a novelist has a new book about Hitler, the Virgin Mary, or Jesus Christ, I think you're looking at a person who may be running out of ideas. It's like a talk show host idea of what an important novel should be. We're at our best when we're rescuing the forgotten, the ridiculous, the weak, the unfashionable. In writing of the Natchez Trace, Eudora Weldy was able to not only harness the narrative power of her characters' immediate lives, she could tap into the mythos of the outlaw Hart brothers, the lost Choctaw tribes, the rebels Aaron Burr and Harmon Blennerhassett, and most of all, the great river that moved in flood like an animal over the land, restless, extinguishing the designs of man, ruining commerce, turning yesterday's mansion into a shattered and waterlogged wreck. She writes that a place that ever was lived in is like a fire that never goes out. It flares up, it smolders for a time, it is fanned or smothered by circumstance, but its being is intact, forever fluttering within it, the result of some original ignition. Sometimes it gives out glory, sometimes its little light must be sought out to be seen, small and tender as a candle flame, but is certain. And you can't help but think of that in Wilmington and places like it that have been used successfully by different people for different reasons. It's such a rich history. But you also can't discount, so often the suburban world is discounted. People think of it as not being a place, but it is a place. People have lived there. It is a construct, and it's just as powerful. So I think to segue into emotional immediacy, I think there's an inverse problem with first person in contemporary work, which is that you don't have that immediate benefit of hindsight and distance that you get from historical writing. So you have different problems. When you're writing a first person book, your protagonist, you can fall into the trap of making that person your hero, especially if they're close to your own experience. And when I'm reading a lot of work now, sort of like, work of like Ben Lerner and some others, the flaneur who's going, the intellectual character who's moving to the city, I find that one of the problems with the work, and while there are many things to admire in it, it's often injured by solipsism. You have a clever protagonist who's trying to impress us with his knowledge of the world, who wants to be liked and admired while claiming otherwise, which I do find disingenuous. And the secondary and tertiary characters are often crowded out, sometimes even smothered. And a lot of these writers are the heirs to Sebald, but they don't tap into Sebald's vision. You know, his historical guilt and alienation created this narrative distance, and it's so genuine, I'm not sure if it can be replicated. But that's, if you're writing any notes, I think that the mark of a good writer, you have to give love and attention to characters other than your protagonist. It's very important, and it's the mark, and you can tell immediately. If the secondary and other characters are just little sketches, there's something out of whack there. So as another aside regarding distance and personal narrative, I think it's why, and it's easy to forget this, why Norman Mailer was so groundbreaking in the 60s. And it was important because he was able to give distance to his own experience by shifting from the first person into the third person, in writing about himself from the third person. In books like Armies of the Night and further back, The Education of Henry Adams had a similar effect. It makes for a bracing reading experience because it gives distance and yet also contains sharp emotional experience. So this will be an important point later in the talk, distance plus emotion. So what's hard about historical fiction, where you get this great distance and myth and scope and time? Emotional immediacy. So creating an empathetic reaction in your reader, I think, takes more work. Writing historical fiction compounds a problem that we often face when writing in the third person. Whereas first person fiction immediately creates a certain intimacy between reader and character, and the voice lends verisimilitude. You think there's a human behind this. It's almost an immediate reaction. It's a voice, it's a person, it's almost always convincing. In historical fiction and in third person, you really have to take care to craft this intimacy. Why do I care about these people? Really, if you're writing historical fiction, it's your main challenge, your struggle, what separates the artist and the pretender. Otherwise, your violence will come off as crass, your details as mere research, your people as cardboard cutouts. So my first point, you have to think of a writer like John Cheever, especially in his greatest stories, like Goodbye, My Brother, or The Country Husband. He minds a vain despair of sadness, but he's also quite funny and he makes you feel. I'm just going to point out a little excerpt. Some of you have it here. If you want to take a look, get your coffee. But if you don't, it's no tragedy. So this is from The Country Husband. It begins at the bottom of page 326. Are people familiar with this story? If you read it? Yeah, and it's kind of a classic, but to set it up, you have this commuter, Francis Weed, who's coming home, and I read this again on my flight yesterday, which was quite a mistake, because it begins with a plane crash. He's flying home here on the plane, and I'm reading more quickly, and I know Francis is going to live because, you know, Cheever's an old mental friend, and, you know, people are panicking. It falls out of the sky, falls into this rain-strafed cornfield in Pennsylvania, and inexplicably they all live. They file out, they get in taxi cabs, they, you know, get on the train, and someone says it's like the Marne, you know, they commandeer the town's taxi cabs, and he goes home, and it's the most intense experience of his adult life, and he goes home to his family and his children, and he's kind of stunned that it's light outside. I'm just going to read a little piece. Think about how he modulates emotion over the course of this section. Francis, taking off his hat and putting down his paper, was not consciously pleased with the scene. He was not that reflective. It was his element, his creation. And he returned to it with a sense of lightness and strength with which any creature returns to his home. Hi, everybody, he said, the plane from Minneapolis. 9 times out of 10, Frances would be greeted with affection, but tonight the children are absorbed in their own antagonisms. Francis had not finished his sentence about the plane crash before Henry plants a kick in Louisa's behind. Louisa swings around saying, "Damn you." Francis makes the mistake of scolding Louisa for bad language before he punishes Henry. Now Louisa turns on her father and accuses him of favoritism. Henry is always right. She is persecuted and lonely. Her lot is hopeless. Francis turns to his son, but the boy has justification for the kick. She hit him first. She hit him on the ear, which is dangerous. Louisa agrees with this passionately. She hit him on the ear, and she meant to hit him on the ear because he messed up her china collection. Henry says this is a lie. Little Toby turns away from the wood box to throw in some evidence for Louisa. Henry claps his hands over little Toby's mouth. Francis separates the two boys, but accidentally pushes Toby into the wood box. Toby begins to cry. Louisa is already crying. Just then, the wife, Julia Weed, comes into the part of the woman where the table is laid. She is a pretty, intelligent woman, and the white in her hair is premature. She does not seem to notice the fracas. "Hello, darling," she says serenely to Francis. "Wash your hands, everyone. Dinner is ready." She strikes a match and lights the 6 candles in this veil of tears. This simple announcement, like the war cry of the Scottish chieftains, only refreshes the ferocity of the combatants. Louisa gives Henry a blow on the shoulder. Henry, although he seldom cries, has pitched his 9 innings and is tired. He bursts into tears. Little Toby discovers a splinter in his hand and begins to howl. Francis says loudly that he has been in a plane crash and that he is tired. And now a line part of this, but he keeps making these attempts to bring up the plane crash and the domestic battlefield. He keeps getting pushed away. No one wants to speak of it. And I'm just going to jump down to the bottom of this masterful section. So they make this attempt at dinner, and it goes about as well as you can imagine. Julia returns with Toby, and they all sit down and are served. "Do I have to look at that big fat slob?" Henry says of Louisa. Everybody but Toby enters into the skirmish, and it rages up and down the table for 5 minutes. Toward the end, Henry puts his napkin over his head and, trying to eat that way, spills spinach all over his shirt. Francis asks Julia if the children couldn't have their dinner earlier. Julia's guns are loaded for this. She can't cook 2 dinners and lay 2 tables. She paints with lightning strokes that panorama of drudgery in which her youth, her beauty, and her wit have been lost. Francis says that he must be understood. He was nearly killed in an airplane crash, and he doesn't like to come home every night to a battlefield. Now Julia is deeply concerned. Her voice trembles. He doesn't come home every night to a battlefield. The accusation is stupid and mean. Everything was tranquil until he arrived. She stops speaking, puts down her knife and fork, and looks into her plate as if it is a gulf. She begins to cry. "Poor Mommy," Toby says, and when Julia gets up from the table, drying her eyes with a napkin, Toby goes to her side. "Poor Mommy," he says, "poor Mommy." And they climb the stairs together. The other children drift away from the battlefield, and Francis goes into the back garden for a cigarette and some air. Right. And there's so much good going on in this writing. Besides the prose is incredible, but the family, the domestic argument, it has this lushness, and it's something that Alan Gerganis, who was my teacher and studied with Cheever, liked to say that, there are these peaks and valleys. It's like a sine curve, the laughter and the sadness, the highs are higher and the lows are lower. And he really modulates this throughout and keeps kind of upping the ante and then bringing it back down. And it's very important. So I'm going to go on. It's so dynamic. So why don't we think we have to do this when we're writing historic fiction? This versus the writing of blank. I'm not going to say who blank is. I almost did because I don't try to criticize living writers, but whatever. This person is one the big awards and gotten the Genius grants, so I don't feel a lot of guilt. But when I read this writer's work, I feel like it's dead on the page, because there's this thought behind it: if I only do enough research, it will be enough. No, that's not enough. You know, the characters seem like little wind-up toys that are sent forth through the world. One can see the author's hand twisting the keys on their backs. Their emotions are just unconvincing. The work is more concerned with showing off the writer's research than giving true life to the characters. You know, you have to make the dead clay come alive. And I think when you're approaching historical work yourself and you're doing research and you're getting all these great facts, it's sort of the tar pit that's so easy to fall into. And, you know, how to bring Cheever's emotional battlefield to historical fiction while balancing it with the great knowledge and time and history and vision that historical fiction has. So let me talk about a novel that's fairly new to me, a North Carolina book recommended to me by a North Carolinian, Alan Gerganis. It's John Ely's The Landbreakers. Has anyone read it? You know, it's really fabulous. It was published in 1968, and I'd never heard of it, but New York Review of Books Classics recently reissued it, and it's been praised by Michael Ondaatje and Harper Lee and others. And he, kind of a fun fact, he's the father of Jennifer Ely, the actor, and he's still living. I want to take a look at The Landbreakers, just to set it up. In a few of you have excerpts. It's set in Western North Carolina, like 1770s, late 1770s, and it starts with two indentured servants who have kind of escaped, and they come to new ground and they're farming it, Mooney and his wife. And for the first 18 pages of it, they're like working the land and they're breaking the ground and cutting the trees, and it's like a 400-page book, and you're like, okay, so this is the story about their marriage. And I don't want to ruin it, but I have to talk about it because this is a craft talk, right? Here's another thing to write down. So on about page 18, within the span of a page, the wife, they aren't married, but the indentured servant, she gets sick with a fever, and within a page and a half, she's dead, right? And this effect, it just has a way, it just takes the ground, it just turns it beneath you as a reader. You think, oh, my conception of this book was wrong. This is a serious book. What's going to happen in the next 380 pages? It gives it that epic vision of myth where people, you know, live, die. And, you know, I think that's a really interesting effect in novels, where I think the best novels, about 20, 30 pages in, there's usually something that blows open the story, that totally changes it, makes it turn at a right angle, makes it larger. And you know, you see people who are mainly story people, short story writers trying to do this, and it's like they can't quite do it. They can't bring themselves to expand the novel. Kind of a similar effect, in a totally different way, is Scott Spencer's Endless Love. I don't know if anyone's read that, but it's a good novel, and the opening, it begins and it's a very romantic teenage love story. You know, it almost comes sappy in some ways. It's just so romantic. But then about on page 20, suddenly this like really graphic anal sex scene just happens. And you're like, wow, this is not the book I was expecting. And it totally changes the way you've read the last 20 pages and the rest of the book. And it took control, because of what, if you put on page 1, it would be craziness. But just the way he does it just totally shifts the book in a different way. So you can see I'm a believer in these unexpected turns early in the book. So I'm going to just talk about chapter 5, and it's in the handout. So to set this up, Mooney Wright, who has been a very sympathetic character in the novel, who's this indentured servant, uneducated, self-made man, escaped. He's proving this ground. You know, his wife died, or shall say she was carrying their child. And he's kind of involved with the other families are coming into the area, and he's involved with a younger woman who's probably like 16 or 17, and they've been sleeping together. And this also is good because it corrodes your ideas of like values, like how conservative it was. I mean, colonial America was weird and wide open. When a lot of the social boundaries had not been built up, there was actually a lot of porosity at that time, which is fascinating. So I'm going to talk about in this little section, there's a woman who's come to the area named Lori. She's married, but her husband isn't on the scene. She has two 9-year-old boys. Her family's there, but she's living alone with them. And one day he decides he kills a deer, and he leaves a quarter of it on their cabin door just out of kindness, because they're these boys, and he can tell she's struggling a little bit. And this husband's nowhere to be seen. And so she wants him to come in. He says, no, this is just a gift. But then he gets to thinking, which is always a dangerous thing for all mortals to do. So I'm just going to read this little section and let it unfold. He made a trap and baited it with berries. He caught a hen turkey in it and took it to her. He stood out in the yard and told her how he had trapped it, and she listened attentively, and when he was done, asked him in. It was all as if it had been expected, even rehearsed by the both of them. He sat down in the only chair. It's on page 76, right? He sat down in the only chair. The boys were at the other end of the cabin, and they watched guardedly. They were awed of him yet, he noticed. She told the older one, Fate, to get under the bed and find 4 sweet potatoes, and watch for snakes, she said. The boy went under and came out with a little fiber-webbed sack, which had only 3 potatoes in it. Just need 3, she told him, quick as anything. Wipe some grease on them, she told him, and he did, but he used the grease in the slut, which was a piece of wood she had gouged out to hold fuel for candle burning. She scolded him for that and told him to get it out of the grease gourd. She got the salt herself. She had it hid from the boys in a gourd. She had to break the gourd to get the salt out, for it had caked in there. Mooney's mouth watered at once when he saw it. I like salt better than anything on a piece of meat, he told her, speaking up suddenly. He leaned back in the chair, tilted it against the wall. The plovers had salt for a while, he said. Now they're all out of salt, and everything else seems like. So am I. I've got a bit of meal too, she said, and glanced at him to catch his approval. If you'll stay for supper, I'll make a bite of bread. Before he could answer, he said, Here, Fate, you get down to the spring and fetch a pail of water. Fate was gone at once. He always did what she said, as if he were waiting on instructions from her, and she always seemed to call on him, leaving the other boy to make his own way. Hey, boy, Mooney said to him. The boy's lips powdered out. What's your name, boy? Berlin is his name. Does he know his name? Why, I reckon she does, she said, straightening up, surprised. Let him answer then. Come here, boy, and I'll show you something. He felt in his belt and got out his piece of a knife. It wasn't much, but it would do to show a boy. You do what he says, Berlin, she said. Let him be, Mooney said, wishing she would hush. Come here, fella. He showed him the knife, but the boy held back. Huh, Mooney said, studying the knife, as if he saw a stain or a mark on it. Look at there, huh? Must have done that when I was off Indian hunting. Berlin strained forward. His mother cast a critical glance at Mooney, but held quiet this time. Got an Indian hair on it. He held the knife up close to his face. Berlin inched closer, trying to see. He came so close he got his head between Mooney's head and the knife. He was trying to see the Indian hair. Lori said, You ever been Indian hunting, for a fact? Mooney winked at her, but the boy didn't see him, and he didn't pay any attention to the frown. She doesn't have as keen a sense of humor as she ought to, he thought. I'll get you a knife, Berlin, he said. The boy's eyes darted up to his. The boy didn't believe him. Seemed like couldn't quite accept it. I will, I promise you. Fate came inside with the water. Lori mixed the meal, and soon the cabin was smelling of cornbread baking. She was a busy woman. never wasted a motion of her hand. She never moved except for a reason. She knew exactly what she was doing with every scratch of time, and that little black-headed boy stayed as close to her as her skirt hem. "What's his name?" Mooney asked her. "Fate," she said. The other one, the towel-headed boy, was still standing near Mooney, still holding the knife, and now he watched his older brother critically. "Where's your papa?" Mooney asked. He said it simply. The question came to him, and he asked it naturally. He hadn't worried about it, for it was so that the man was gone, and that was the fact of the matter. That was what mattered to him. But Lori seemed to get cold and taut at once, and she got to stirring the stew in the pot faster than before. He asked, "Ain't he dead?" "No," she said, stirring faster still. "Did he get lost?" "Might have got lost." Mooney waited for her to go on, but she didn't. "A man can go hunting and something happen, he not get back," he suggested, helping her along. She turned to him. "He left home to go to Kentucky and see what was there in the way of a new chance for us. But he didn't come back, and after a year, Papa sent a man to find him, and the man said Lacey had gone on to Watauga. Papa told me that, and I said, 'Well, Papa, Lacey must not have liked me much to have gone so far.'" She said it simply but firmly. No, she wasn't evading anything. She would be better off to face. He put in a crop of corn and sorghum before he left, I'll say that for him. He wasn't a lazy man, but he liked work that didn't delay you too long. Not work over the seasons, not to wait like you have to for crops and stock. And the scene goes on, right? And if we map, in my mind, if we can map the tenor of it, it's very offhand and light in their eating, but then he's bringing up, it's like the first thing you do when you go on a date. "So what's the deal? Where's this guy?" I mean, it's a horrible choice in real life, but it makes for exciting reading. In fiction, he's just poking, like, "Well, where is he? Where is he?" And these people do not know each other. They're strangers. Now, my second point is to say, in historical fiction, our ancestors were like us, but they were not like us. This gap is fascinating, and the best historical fiction plays on this gray area. Yes, they lived and loved and pined away, just like us, but their values and sentiments were often radically different, and it's dangerous and even irresponsible to project contemporary values upon them. When such happens, we're usually doing it consciously or subconsciously to comfort the reader. But Joy Williams tells us that art should not comfort or soothe, otherwise it's just wallpaper, and otherwise it's genre fiction which plays to formula. So I want to read an excerpt, and let's think about how this plays. This is very short. So what goes on? They sit there, they're talking, they're having dinner in Lori's cabin, and near the end, they're just kind of speaking of the world. They're talking about the weather. Exciting. But then it goes into this. "It is," he said, "there was no church and no preacher up here, but they could post their bonds and could hold a service when a preacher came through." "Is that your black pot there in the yard?" he asked her. She said it was. So speaks to Verlin, the boy. "Verlin, you go get your clothes off the cabin and put them in that pot." Verlin stared at him incredulously, then at his mother, who gazed off, no doubt as surprised as Verlin. Slowly Verlin went into the cabin, fate glaring at him, and slowly he came back out, carrying his clothes. He went to the black pot and stood there considering his mission. He looked back at Mooney. Mooney nodded encouragingly. He looked at his mother, but she was stiff and solemn and acted as if she hadn't noted he was anywhere about. Verlin shrugged, stepped up to the pot and threw the clothes into it, and stood stiffly still, waiting for the rebuke he was sure would come. "Fate, you go get your clothes now," Mooney said, "and put them in the pot." Fate held his place there at the cabin door. He didn't budge. Lori stared off at her father's house. "Very well, Verlin," Mooney said. "Get the bags of seed off the wall pegs and put them in the pot." Verlin fetched the bag of seeds, went straight to the pot and dropped them in. "The yarn," Mooney said to him. Verlin got it and put it in the pot. The bowls and trenchers, Mooney said. Verlin put them in the pot. Fate, Mooney said, turning once more to him. Get that quilt off the bed and bundle it so you can carry it. Fate didn't move. Mooney waited, then got up slowly. He moved past the boy and went to where the quilt was. He folded it into a square, then folded that. Fate was standing near the door watching him. Mooney laid the quilt by, then, in a single motion, brought his hand around and slapped the boy on the face. And the boy, knocked back, stunned, stared at him, hurt and frightened and angry. Mooney saw Lori in the yard. She almost cried out, but she stayed quiet. Next time I send you for something, go get it, Mooney said. He went outside, confused, unnerved by the boy who was crying. He could hear him. Verlin, get that wheel down from the rafters, he said, feeling miserable. And he went off to the lambing pens and locked the sheep in for the night. So, two things. Ely is so smart. When there's that section and he just slaps that boy as hard as he can, of course we recoil, right? I mean, we find it morally offensive, especially coming from our sympathetic protagonist, who we feel sympathy for and will continue to do it. But he just slaps this kid who is not his child. This is the first interaction, the first night we've ever really had together. So he slaps that child, but Ely doesn't flinch. He does it. Back then, it's totally perfect for the time period. I mean, this is 1780. He's asserting his dominance over the house, slapping this child. It makes us recoil, but if you polled most people in this community, they would say, well, of course, right? And there's that moment here when Ely, the mother, doesn't say anything, and she says, all right. And that's the heartbreaking moment, I feel like, for me as a reader. There's that moment for her to be the one who stands up and says, I've been running this house for 5 years. Things are going perfectly well. Get the fuck out. Leave. But she doesn't do it. Okay? She doesn't do that. And I think it's very important. It has the ring of truth in it. And I think that's seeing how they're like us and not like us. And I'm going to end in a second, but just one last, if we're going for awkward situations in historical fiction, let's just do one more, okay? How to give it the punch and thrust and awkwardness that we all have in our daily lives. So he's making these kids take all their belongings, and they're moving to his cabin that night. Like he's the father. They haven't discussed marriage. They haven't discussed this, but it's happening. And there's that early line. It's like they made a wager. And this is on 86. They're talking. She crouched by the fire. This is his cabin, where she didn't know where to sit. She didn't think she ought to sit down on the bed. That would be unseemly. Also, it would be deceptive, for she wasn't anxious in her body yet. She had come to the place not for body affection, so much as a need to have a father care given her boys, to find a protected place for a family again, which is what she craved deeply. She heard him taking off his clothes. Upstairs, she guessed the boys were watching through cracks in the loft floor, and no doubt they were in a toil of wonder about what was going on tonight. Imagine this cabin. They're in the bed, and there's just like a loft above them, where these two 9-year-old boys are sleeping. She had come to the Fate, more than the other, would be concerned, for he had been given a blow and a command already. That wouldn't set well with him. Fate had the fiery spirit of his father, a high walking pride that set him apart from others and made him special somehow, as his father had been, even in his own eyes. She began to take off her clothes. She took off her dress and found a wall peg near the fire and hung it up. She went over to the bed, wearing her undergown, which was thin and body clinging. He was glancing at her. She wasn't surprised at that. She wasn't ashamed either, for she had been well made from the start, and the bearing of 2 boys had cost her only slightly of her shape. He was undressed now and was standing over in the corner of the room beyond the table. She could hear the boys breathing upstairs. She wished she could assure them that she wasn't afraid. She was uneasy, though, for the place was new to her, and he, standing over near the corner, didn't seem to be at ease himself, and she didn't know him all that well. She crawled onto the bed and pulled the ragged quilt over herself. She didn't look at him when he went to the fire. She heard him pick up the pail of water, and she heard the water splash onto the fire. There came a hissing, a sizzling, a roar of steam up the chimney, and she heard the boys gasp. Then the room was dark, except for the gray smoke that the chimney was sucking up, and except for a few bright coals that were left. She heard nothing now except the fire. She saw his outline as he crossed before the fireplace. He stopped near the table, and she could make out the figure of his body, the strong lines of it, the bigness of him, and the upright manner he had and the set of his head. He stood there naked by the table, as if thinking about what he was to do. She saw him move toward her. He became part of the shadows around her. Then she felt his hand grope along the bed and touch her shoulder. It moved along her shoulder to her neck, and his hand, coarse and hard as shoe leather, touched her face, her cheek and chin, and his fingers moved along the outline of her chin. He sat down on the bed and leaned forward, and his chin touched her forehead. He rested his head on her head, and she felt his hands seek to hold her. He knelt beside her on the floor, and his hands moved over her breasts and shoulders, and he spoke to her, and his voice was deeper than Lacey's, and she was trembling and waiting. Then he was lying beside her, and he came to her, and it was the most natural act in the world, seemed like, to take him into herself and into her own body and seek with him the moment of longing and the planting of the birth of their own kind here in their own house. So, just to end, I think that this modulation of emotion, it swings us in different directions, but it also mines that place for history and myth. And I think if any of you are trying to write works set in the historical past, if you can harness that power of history and myth and emotion, your work can do that too. So that's it.